In the spring of 1203, a teenage boy disappeared from a castle in Normandy, and no one ever saw him again. His name was Arthur of Brittany, and by many reasonable interpretations of law and custom, he was the rightful king of England. His fate remains one of the medieval world's most chilling unsolved questions, with evidence pointing in a deeply uncomfortable direction. Incredibly, this disappearance would start a chain reaction that would help bring down a massive medieval empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. To understand why Arthur mattered, we have to understand the succession crisis that erupted when Richard the Lionheart died in April 1199. Richard left no legitimate children, which proved to be a significant issue for the English and French holdings later dubbed the Angevin Empire by historians. Under the principle of primogeniture, the crown should arguably have passed to Arthur, the son of Richard's deceased older brother, Geoffrey. Arthur was born in 1187, after Geoffrey's death, making him the posthumous heir of the elder Plantagenet line. But medieval succession wasn't always a straightforward matter of bloodline, and raw power was often the deciding force despite what the succession laws said. Richard's youngest brother John moved quickly, seizing the treasury at Chinon and racing to be crowned. He had powerful allies, proximity to England's political machinery, and crucially, he was an adult, while Arthur was only 12. In medieval politics, a child claimant without a powerful protector was little more than a target. This situation was further complicated by Eleanor of Aquitaine, the now elderly but still extremely formidable Queen Mother. Eleanor threw her considerable influence behind John, understanding that a child king controlled by French regents would be disastrous. She worked tirelessly to secure John's position, effectively abandoning her grandson to political irrelevance. Her choice would have consequences that echoed through the rest of the century and beyond. The legal argument for Arthur's claim was strong but not unchallenged. English custom sometimes favored the nearest surviving brother of a dead king over a nephew, particularly when that nephew was a minor. Continental tradition, on the other hand, leaned firmly toward the throne passing to Arthur. Arthur had a very legitimate case, but the political winds favored John, especially in England itself. The English baronage preferred a grown man who could lead armies over a boy who'd need a regent, and who came with Breton advisors. They may have also seen John as a known factor, someone who could be controlled and manipulated by them, rather than by continental nobles. In Brittany, and among French-aligned nobles, however, Arthur was recognized as the rightful Plantagenet heir. His claim carried weight under the legal customs of the Angevin continental territories. Philip II, the powerful king of France, saw an enormous opportunity in this fractured succession. By backing Arthur's claim, he could shatter the Angevin Empire from within, breaking the continental power of the English throne that rivaled his own. Philip accepted Arthur's homage for Brittany, Anjou, and Aquitaine, recognizing him as the legitimate ruler of vast continental territories. For Arthur, still barely a teenager, this alliance with the French crown was both his greatest asset and his greatest vulnerability. He became a pawn in a game far larger than himself, manipulated by forces that cared nothing for his welfare. Every adult in his orbit had their own agenda, and none of those agendas prioritized keeping him alive the moment he ceased to be politically useful. The decisive moment came in the summer of 1202, when Arthur, now 15, was persuaded to besiege the castle of Mirbeau. His own grandmother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, was staying at Mirbeau, making the siege a direct family confrontation, a disastrous miscalculation in hindsight. John's forces, led by William de Roche, executed a lightning march and caught Arthur's army off guard at dawn on August 1st. The victory was total, and Arthur was captured along with hundreds of supporters, including prominent Breton nobles. John's troops covered roughly 80 miles in 48 hours to reach Mirbeau, a feat of forced marching that showed real military skill by an otherwise incompetent king. But if you're familiar with King John's reign, you'll know that he would somehow manage to fumble this generational victory. It was a military triumph, but what followed would prove to be one of the medieval world's greatest political catastrophes. John immediately alienated William de Roche by refusing to consult him on the treatment of the prisoners. William defected to the French side, taking much of the Angevin military apparatus along with him. It was a pattern that defined John's reign, turning victories into disasters through sheer political incompetence. John initially held Arthur at Falaise, one of the great ducal castles of Normandy. Chroniclers writing within a generation say John visited Arthur in captivity and tried to persuade him to abandon his claim. Arthur reportedly refused, insisting on his rights to the Angevin inheritance and demanding the release of his companions. Whether this account is precisely accurate is unknowable, but the political reality behind it rings true. Arthur being alive was a permanent rallying point for John's enemies, and while Arthur supporting John might have been useful, his defiant stand was intolerable. By early 1203, Arthur was transferred to the castle of Rouen, the capital of the Duchy of Normandy, and then, just like that, he disappeared off the face of the earth. There was no public trial, no announcement of his death, and no burial record that has ever been found. He simply ceased to exist in the historical record after entering Rouen's keep, and the silence itself is damning. A king doesn't simply misplace a nephew who happens to be his chief political rival, nor do kings quietly lose track of their most important political prisoners. Arthur's disappearance was almost certainly deliberate, and the absence of any official explanation implies those responsible knew the truth couldn't be spoken. Several near-contemporary chroniclers offered accounts of Arthur's death, and while they differ in detail, they converge on one point. The Annals of Margam, written at a Welsh abbey with connections to the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, provide the most explicit account. According to this source, John himself slew Arthur after dinner on the Thursday before Easter in April 1203, while drunk. The body was reportedly weighted with a stone and thrown into the Seine to cover up the enormity of the crime. Under this telling, the river became Arthur's unmarked grave, swallowing all physical evidence of the shameful act. This chronicle was composed within a few decades of the event, and claims its information came from reliable informants. Ralph of Coggeshall, a famous English chronicler of the same period, offered a somewhat different version. He recorded that John initially sent servants to Falaise with orders to blind Arthur and render him a eunuch, rendering him politically useless. The only problem is that this order would have been considered more reprehensible than an execution in the medieval mind. The Castellan, Hubert de Burgh, supposedly refused to carry out the order precisely because this would have been viewed as a virtually unforgivable sin. According to Ralph, Hubert later claimed Arthur had died, only to reveal him to be alive when the outcry from Breton nobles threatened wider rebellion. Ralph's account trails off regarding Arthur's ultimate fate, but the implication is clear enough that the young claimant didn't survive much longer after this reprieve. Another chronicler, a Flemish source with court connections, added yet another layer to the story. This account described how Arthur was moved between locations, and that his fate was a matter of rumor, even among John's own courtiers. The uncertainty itself became a political weapon, with John apparently content to let ambiguity reign. This suggests that whatever happened to Arthur was perhaps so horrific that even those most loyal to King John had to be kept in the dark. William the Breton, a French chronicler close to King Philip II, placed blame squarely on John for the slaying. The Breton tradition was even more emphatic, casting Arthur as a martyred prince killed by a fearful usurper. However, this account clearly had a political motivation, given that it was authored by a person with a strong interest in seeing Arthur alive. Notably, no credible medieval source ever suggested Arthur survived or died of natural causes. Whatever happened at Rouen, the consequences were enormous, and Arthur's disappearance triggered exactly the kind of political crisis John had presumably hoped to avoid. The Breton nobility was outraged since they'd lost their duke, and they held John personally responsible for whatever happened. King Philip, who was King John's liege lord in relation to his French holdings, demanded that John appear in Paris to answer for his crimes against Arthur. When John predictably refused to appear, Philip declared all of John's French fiefs forfeit, an act that wasn't just legal theater. It provided the legal basis for a French campaign that would, by 1204, strip John of Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. The Angevin continental empire, built over generations and which was wealthier than all of England, collapsed in barely 2 years. The loss of Normandy was catastrophic for John's reputation and his reign. English barons holding lands on both sides of the Channel were forced to choose between their English and Norman holdings. Importantly, most of the most powerful members of the English nobility had substantial continental holdings. Many barons blamed John directly, and the whispered accusations surrounding Arthur's fate followed him for the rest of his life. Even John's loyalist barons were reportedly horrified, not by the act itself, but by the clumsiness and political stupidity of it. A king who couldn't even manage the optics of eliminating a rival was a king who couldn't be trusted. The political toxicity of Arthur's fate fed directly into the broader baronial discontent building against John. This discontent would eventually produce the crisis of 1215, and ultimately, the Magna Carta. The barons who forced John to seal that charter at Runnymede were motivated by many grievances, but trust was central to all of them. A king capable of slaying his own nephew in the most haphazard way possible was a king whose promises meant nothing without enforceable guarantees. Of course, John didn't lose his continental possessions solely because of Arthur's death, but the mysterious disappearance provided his enemies with a moral justification that proved devastatingly effective across the political landscape. Notably, Hubert de Burgh, who features in several accounts as the man who initially refused to harm Arthur, had a successful later career. He served as Justiciar of England under Henry III, rising to become one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Whether this reflects genuine moral courage or complicated complicity that was conveniently rewritten is impossible to determine. After all, medieval political survival often required a flexible relationship with the truth. Arthur of Brittany was 16 years old at most when he died. He never ruled, never commanded an army in any meaningful sense, and never proved or disproved his fitness for the crown. Everything about his short life was shaped by the ambitions of others. His mother Constance of Brittany used his claim to maintain Breton independence from the Plantagenet crown. Philip Augustus used it to destabilize the Angevin Empire, and John eliminated it in the most final way available. What makes Arthur's case resonate both now and in the past is the combination of his youth, his strong claim, and the brazenness of his disappearance. While eliminating political rivals was by no means unheard of, this simply wasn't how things were done. Rival claimants had quote-unquote hunting accidents, or suddenly took ill after eating a lavish meal. If the most sensationalistic version of the story is true, John did the deed with his own hands, a true aberration even in the cruel world of medieval Europe. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder to hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying my content. Also, remember to check out the Patreon or YouTube membership if you enjoy my content and want to support my channel further. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had become the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, Mongol armies had swept across Central Asia, obliterated kingdoms, sacked Baghdad, and pushed deep into Europe. They'd conquered Song China, subjugated Korea, and destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire with terrifying speed and precision. From the steppes of Mongolia to the very gates of Vienna, no military force on earth had successfully resisted them in a sustained campaign. So when Kublai Khan turned his attention toward the Japanese archipelago in the 1270s, his advisors assumed it'd be another easy conquest. Japan was a collection of islands ruled by feudal warriors who'd never faced a continental superpower or encountered Mongol siege tactics. At least that's what the Mongols believed, and they had every reason to be confident given their record of military triumph. What actually happened across two invasion attempts in 1274 and 1281 turned out to be a dramatic reversal of expectations. It became one of the most consequential military episodes of the medieval world, and it changed the trajectory of Japanese history forever. The story doesn't begin with ships and swords, though. It begins with letters. Starting in 1268, Kublai Khan dispatched diplomatic missions to Japan, demanding submission to Mongol authority. The letters were blunt: comply and establish tributary relations, or face invasion, standard procedure for the Mongols. These messages were received by the Kamakura shogunate, the military government that held real political power in Japan at the time, while the emperor in Kyoto remained the nominal head of state. The Kamakura government made the decisions that actually mattered. The idea that the head of state of Japan called himself an emperor had long been an affront to the Chinese. Under their belief, all countries were subject to the Chinese emperor, and the emperor himself had been granted that position by heaven itself. For the Japanese, to accept tributary status to China was completely unacceptable, as it undermined the entire imperial household and the Japanese state itself. The court in Kyoto was alarmed, and temples and shrines were ordered to pray for the nation's protection. That response might seem quaint, but it reflected the genuine terror the Mongol name inspired across all of Asia. The regent Hojo Tokimune, barely 18 years old when the first letter arrived, refused to respond to Kublai's demands. Subsequent Mongol envoys were turned away, and eventually, in a dramatic escalation, later envoys were executed on the spot. Tokimune's defiance wasn't reckless bravado, but a calculated political statement about Japanese sovereignty. The shogun understood that submission would mean the end of Japanese sovereignty and the dismantling of the samurai class's power. If the imperial system was undermined, the samurai, who had positioned themselves as quote-unquote protectors of the emperor, would be disenfranchised. Kublai Khan launched his first invasion force in the autumn of 1274, assembling a fleet on the Korean peninsula. Korea, then known as Goryeo, had been forced into vassal status and was compelled to provide ships, sailors, and soldiers for the campaign. The invasion force was substantial, likely numbering around 900 vessels, carrying roughly 15,000 Mongol and Chinese soldiers. An additional 8,000 Korean troops joined the expedition, along with siege engineers and some cavalry. Transporting horses across the sea presented serious logistical challenges, but the Mongols were determined to bring their arsenal. The Mongol fleet first struck Tsushima, a small island in the strait between Korea and Japan, where the local garrison was overwhelmed. The island's defender, So Sukekuni, led perhaps 80 mounted warriors against thousands of Mongol troops in a hopeless last stand. The defenders were massacred, and the civilian population suffered terribly under Mongol rule, apparently foreshadowing the doom that awaited Japan as a whole. The invaders then moved on to Iki Island, where the pattern repeated with similar brutality. These early engagements gave the Mongols confidence and sent shockwaves through the Japanese mainland as reports spread. The main landing took place at Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu, where the real battle would unfold. Here, the Japanese defenders got their first real look at Mongol warfare, and it was unlike anything they'd encountered. The Mongols used coordinated unit tactics, massed infantry formations, poisoned arrows, and explosive gunpowder bombs. The noise and smoke were disorienting, and Japanese warriors described the thunderous explosions as something from another world. I feel that it's necessary to describe briefly how different the Japanese approach to war and combat was to the Mongolian approach. Japanese warfare at this time was heavily influenced by traditions of individual combat and personal dueling between worthy opponents. Warriors would ride forward, announce their lineage and accomplishments, and seek out rivals for one-on-one encounters. This format of combat was highly ritualized and emphasized elements like honorable conduct on the battlefield and personal displays of valor. While the Mongols may have had somewhat similar values in intertribal conflicts on the Eurasian steppe, they had long since adapted a bureaucratic approach to combat. The Mongols had absolutely no interest in such rituals and fought as disciplined units with coordinated battlefield tactics. They used signal drums and flags to direct movements, surrounding and overwhelming isolated samurai with ruthless efficiency. The fighting at Hakata Bay was intense, and the Japanese were pushed back from the shoreline under heavy pressure. However, the samurai regrouped and mounted fierce resistance, and the terrain itself worked against the Mongol cavalry. The narrow beaches and coastal landscape prevented Mongol horsemen from maneuvering effectively against the defenders. As night fell, the Mongol commanders made a fateful decision, ordering their troops back to the ships rather than pressing inland. That night, a powerful storm struck Hakata Bay, causing significant damage to the anchored Mongol fleet. Several ships were lost, and the invasion force, battered and demoralized, withdrew back to Korea in disarray. And just like that, the first Mongol invasion had failed, and the legend of the storm that helped repel them grew. The 7 years between the invasions were anything but quiet for either side of the conflict. The Kamakura government, now fully aware of the existential threat, undertook an enormous defensive building program. The centerpiece was a massive stone wall constructed along the coastline of Hakata Bay, stretching roughly 20 kilometers. The wall stood about 2 meters high, designed specifically to prevent Mongol cavalry from establishing a beachhead on the shore. It was a remarkable feat of medieval engineering, constructed through the forced labor of samurai vassals from across Kyushu. The remnants of this wall can still be seen in Fukuoka today, a tangible reminder of how seriously Japan took the threat. Beyond physical fortifications, the government reorganized its military command structure and appointed new defense commissioners in Kyushu. Coastal watch stations were established, naval capabilities were improved, and samurai forces were kept on high alert for years. The entire western coast of Japan was placed on a permanent war footing, straining the economic resources of the warrior class. Kublai Khan, meanwhile, continued sending envoys demanding Japan's submission, and the response grew increasingly hostile. In 1275 and again in 1279, Mongol ambassadors were beheaded, a profound insult that left no ambiguity about Japan's position. Kublai was reportedly furious, and the subjugation of Japan became a matter of deep personal prestige for the emperor. The final conquest of the Southern Song dynasty in 1279 freed up enormous military resources for a second attempt at Japan. The Mongols were now fully in control in China, and the stage was set for a far larger invasion than anything the Japanese had yet faced. The 1281 invasion was one of the largest naval operations attempted anywhere in the world before the modern era. Kublai Khan assembled two massive fleets for a coordinated two-pronged assault on the Japanese archipelago. The Eastern Route Army departed from Korea with roughly 900 ships, carrying around 40,000 trained combat troops. The Southern Route Army sailed from southern China with approximately 3,500 vessels and 100,000 soldiers. Many of those soldiers were recently conquered Song Chinese troops whose loyalty to the Mongol cause was questionable at best. The combined force of roughly 140,000 men dwarfed the 1274 expedition in every conceivable way. It represented an almost unprecedented commitment of military resources and logistical planning for a single campaign. And notably, most historians believe these aren't your typical exaggerated pre-modern troop numbers, but rather fairly accurate assessments of Mongol might. The plan called for both fleets to rendezvous near Kyushu and launch a coordinated assault on the Japanese defenses. The Eastern Route Army arrived first in June of 1281 and attempted to land at several points around Hakata Bay. This time, however, they encountered the stone defensive wall that the Japanese had spent 7 years building along the coast. Japanese defenders positioned behind the fortifications rained arrows and launched counterattacks against Mongol forces on the beaches. Small, fast Japanese boats conducted daring nighttime raids against the anchored fleet, boarding ships and setting fires. These guerrilla naval tactics are documented in the famous Mokoshirai Ekotoba scroll, commissioned by the samurai Takazaki Suenaga. The raids proved devastatingly effective against the larger, less maneuverable Mongol vessels crowding the harbor waters. Notably, Takazaki Suenaga is a perfect example of that Japanese approach to warfare I briefly mentioned earlier. His desire to prove his valor in conducting raids on Mongol ships led to the commission of the scrolls that showed the nature of his deeds. If he had been operating under a more bureaucratic system, like the Mongols were, he would have had little incentive to produce these records which historians now rely upon. But I digress. The samurai had adapted considerably since the first invasion, studying Mongol tactics and developing effective countermeasures. Individual combat traditions gave way to coordinated defensive operations, at least temporarily, and the coastal fortifications proved their immense worth. For weeks, the Mongols couldn't establish a secure position on land, and the Eastern Route Army suffered heavy casualties. Most of the invasion force was trapped aboard its ships, unable to break through the Japanese defensive lines on shore. When the Southern Route Army finally arrived in August, the combined fleet anchored in Hakata Bay in massive numbers. It created a vast floating city of ships and soldiers, but the prolonged time at sea had taken a serious toll. Disease spread through the cramped ships, fresh water and provisions ran low, and morale deteriorated rapidly. While this was a Mongol invasion, the vast majority of the soldiers and sailors were Chinese and Korean and had little reason to throw their lives away for a foreign conqueror dynasty. It's theorized that many of these Mongol subjects defected to the Japanese side, bringing valuable intelligence along with them in return for their lives being spared. Then, in mid-August, the decisive blow fell when a massive typhoon slammed into the Mongol fleet with devastating force. The timing couldn't have been worse for the invaders, with ships packed tightly together, unable to maneuver or seek shelter. Thousands of ships were sunk or smashed against the rocks, and tens of thousands of soldiers drowned in the waters. Those who made it to shore were hunted down or captured by Japanese forces waiting on the beaches. Estimates suggest the Mongols lost between 60 and 90% of their entire invasion force in the disaster. It would go down as one of the most devastating military catastrophes in recorded history. The Japanese interpreted the typhoons that destroyed the Mongol fleets as divine intervention by the gods of their homeland. They called these storms kamikaze, meaning divine wind, a term that would echo through Japanese culture for centuries afterward. The belief took hold that Japan was a shinkoku, a sacred land protected by the gods, unconquerable by any foreign power. This concept became deeply embedded in Japan's national identity, reinforced by Shinto priests and Buddhist monks across the country. Religious leaders claimed their prayers had summoned the storms, strengthening the bond between faith and national defense. The consequences of the failed invasions rippled through both Japan and the Mongol Empire in profound ways. For Kublai, the defeats were both humiliating and financially ruinous, draining the Yuan treasury of enormous resources. The invasions had required conscripting tens of thousands of shipbuilders and requisitioning vast quantities of timber and iron. Military resources had been diverted from other frontiers, weakening Mongol positions across the empire's vast holdings. Kublai reportedly considered a third invasion, but was dissuaded by advisors and by the practical difficulties of replacing such losses. Rebellions elsewhere in his empire demanded attention, and the political will for another campaign had evaporated. He died in 1294, a diminished figure in many respects, without ever conquering the island nation that had defied him twice. For Japan, the aftermath was paradoxically both triumphant and destabilizing for the ruling government. The samurai who'd fought to defend Kyushu expected rewards, as was customary after military campaigns. But unlike a typical campaign of conquest, there was no conquered territory to distribute and no plunder to divide among the warriors. The war had been entirely defensive, and the Kamakura government was already under severe financial strain from a decade of preparations. The government couldn't adequately compensate the warriors who'd risked everything, creating deep resentment among the samurai class. This bitterness, particularly fierce in Kyushu, contributed directly to the political instability that toppled the regime in 1333. The very warriors who'd saved Japan from foreign conquest helped bring down the government that had organized the defense. The Mongol invasions of Japan remain one of history's great what-if scenarios and a pivotal moment in East Asian history. Had the typhoons not struck, Japan might have been absorbed into the Mongol Empire, fundamentally altering the region's development. Japanese culture, language, religion, and political structures would have developed along radically different lines under Mongol rule. Given the immense outlay of manpower and other resources, most historians agree that Kublai wouldn't have allowed Japan to maintain any meaningful autonomy. The invasions also demonstrated both the terrifying reach of Mongol power and its very real limitations on the open sea. It perhaps should come as no surprise that a group from Central Asia, with quite literally no naval tradition whatsoever, was not best equipped to handle such an invasion. The immense logistical challenges of seaborne invasion, with unpredictable weather and supply chain vulnerabilities, proved insurmountable. Even the greatest military machine of the medieval era couldn't overcome the fundamental difficulties of projecting power across the ocean. Modern archaeology has added fascinating new dimensions to this story through underwater discoveries off the coast of Nagasaki Prefecture. Researchers found Mongol shipwrecks near Takashima, confirming historical accounts and revealing the hasty construction of the invasion fleet. Many vessels were flat-bottomed riverboats poorly suited for open ocean conditions, built under enormous political pressure. Ceramic artifacts, stone anchor stocks, and weaponry from the seabed painted a vivid picture of the doomed expedition's composition. These findings suggest the fleet was vulnerable even before the typhoon struck, designed for the wrong kind of water entirely. The invasions also reshaped Japanese military culture in lasting and significant ways over the generations that followed. The samurai adapted their tactics, fortification strategies, and understanding of large-scale warfare based on their experience. Facing a continental army forced Japan's warrior class to evolve, and the defensive infrastructure influenced coastal thinking for generations. Perhaps most importantly, the invasion cemented a powerful narrative of Japanese exceptionalism in the national consciousness. The idea that Japan occupied a unique and divinely protected place in the world took deep root in the culture. It was a belief that would profoundly shape the nation's self-understanding well into the modern era. Unfortunately, it was this belief that also led the Japanese leadership in the 20th century to believe that defeat was impossible, a fact that would have disastrous consequences for humanity. For the better part of a century, the Magyar horsemen had been the nightmare of Christian Europe. Riding out of the Hungarian steppe in waves that seemed endless, they'd burned monasteries, sacked cities, and humiliated kings from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. Their raids weren't random acts of violence, but precision operations carried out by some of the finest light cavalry the world had ever seen. These were warriors who could fire arrows at full gallop and vanish before any organized resistance could form. By the middle of the 10th century, people across the German lands, Italy, and France viewed these raids as a permanent condition. It was a seasonal catastrophe, as unavoidable as drought or flood, and no one seemed capable of stopping it. The Magyars had first swept into the Carpathian Basin around 895, a Finno-Ugric people driven west by the Pechenegs. They displaced the peoples already living there and established a base of operations with access to virtually every corner of Europe. From this homeland, war bands fanned out along well-scouted routes, exploiting the political fragmentation of the post-Carolingian world. The old Frankish Empire had shattered into squabbling successor states, with no capacity for coordinated defense. No single ruler possessed the military strength or political authority to mount a coordinated response. Local lords built castles and prayed, and that was about the extent of the strategic response for decades. What made the Magyar threat so difficult to counter was their tactical doctrine of fighting exclusively as mounted archers. They used the composite bow with devastating skill, and their preferred method was the feigned retreat. This maneuver lured overconfident pursuers into disorganized chases before the Magyars wheeled around and destroyed them with arrows. Western heavy cavalry, trained for the direct shock charge, found itself consistently outmaneuvered by these tactics. The Magyars didn't want to stand and fight, nor did they want to occupy land for any period of time. Instead, they wanted to raid, extract tribute from wealthy settled rulers, and leave, returning to the safety of the far western reaches of the Eurasian steppe. That was, at least, until one man decided to put an end to the Hungarian raids once and for all. By 955, the political landscape had shifted in important ways, and one of the successors to Charlemagne was showing serious promise. Otto I, king of the East Franks, and the most powerful ruler in Central Europe, had spent years consolidating his authority. He'd done so through a combination of military force, strategic marriages, and alliance building with the church. He wasn't the first German king to fight the Magyars, and his father, Henry the Fowler, had won a notable victory at the Battle of Riyadh in 933. Henry's program of fortress construction and cavalry reform had begun to change the defensive equation. But Otto now faced a crisis that demanded something far more decisive than border defense. In the summer of 955, a massive Magyar army crossed into Bavaria, possibly numbering between 8,000 and 25,000 warriors. They laid siege to Augsburg, a prosperous city on the Lech River and a critical hub of Bavarian territory. The city's bishop, Ulrich of Augsburg, organized a desperate defense, rallying the garrison. He personally appeared on the walls in full episcopal vestments to stiffen the resolve of the defenders. The Magyars probed the city's defenses and launched assaults, but Augsburg held, buying Otto the time he needed to assemble his forces. Otto moved quickly, gathering contingents from across the German duchies, including troops from Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, Saxony, and Bohemia. Widukind of Corvey, a Saxon monk whose account is among the most valuable primary sources, describes an army of roughly 8 legions. Liutprand of Cremona, another contemporary chronicler, largely corroborates this picture of a substantial force. Historians have generally interpreted the size of Otto's assembled army as somewhere around 10,000 men, which was very large for the era. This reflected the remarkable degree to which Otto had succeeded in commanding loyalty across the fractious German political landscape. Notably, his army also included a Bohemian contingent under Duke Boleslav I, a former bitter enemy brought into Otto's orbit through careful diplomacy. On August 10, 955, the two armies met on the Lechfeld, the broad floodplain south of Augsburg. The Lech River spreads across flat, open ground there, terrain that should have favored the Magyars and their mobile tactics. But the battle didn't begin the way anyone expected it to. The Magyars sent a strong detachment across the river to strike at Otto's supply train and rear guard in a bold flanking maneuver. This flanking force hit the Bohemian and Swabian contingents hard, scattering them in confusion and capturing the entire baggage train. For a terrible moment, it looked as though the Magyars had already won before the main engagement had even properly started. If the German army's cohesion collapsed under the pressure of that devastating rear attack, the entire force would dissolve into a rout. This would have been particularly devastating since the Magyar light cavalry would have been able to obliterate the men on their disorganized retreat. But Otto's response was decisive, and by all accounts personally courageous under the most extraordinary pressure. He redirected his Franconian contingent under Duke Conrad the Red to deal with the flanking threat. Otto himself led the main body forward in a direct frontal assault on the Magyar center, rallying his troops as he rode ahead. Conrad's counterattack succeeded in driving the Magyar flanking force back across the river, saving the army from total disintegration. Conrad himself, however, was killed in the fighting when he loosened his armor in the brutal heat and took an arrow through the throat. His death was a significant and deeply felt loss, but his intervention at the critical moment had preserved the entire German position. The main engagement then became exactly the kind of close-quarters fight the Magyars desperately didn't want. Otto's heavy cavalry, armored knights on powerful war horses, charged directly into the Magyar formations with devastating and terrible force. The Lechfeld, despite being open ground, simply didn't give the Magyars enough room to execute their preferred feigned retreat tactic. The Germans pressed the attack relentlessly, and the brutal close-quarters combat neutralized every advantage the Magyars had in mobility. The battle became a grinding melee, and in that kind of fight, the sheer weight of Western heavy cavalry was simply overwhelming. The Magyar lines broke, and what followed was a relentless pursuit that lasted for days across the Bavarian countryside. The retreating raiders were cut down in enormous numbers, and many drowned attempting to cross swollen rivers in their desperate panic. Villagers and local garrisons, emboldened by the spreading news of victory, fell upon stragglers with a fury born of decades of suffering. The 3 senior Magyar commanders, known in the sources as Bulksu, Lel, and Sur, were captured alive and then hanged at Regensburg. The execution of these enemy leaders was a calculated and deliberate statement of finality from a king who intended to be emperor. He wasn't merely winning a single battle. He was consciously and permanently ending an era of terror that had affected all of Catholic Europe. The Battle of Lechfeld didn't end all Magyar raids overnight, but it broke the strategic pattern that had terrorized Europe for generations. The Magyars never again launched a major incursion into German territory after the catastrophic disaster on the Lechfeld. Within a few decades, the Hungarian ruling dynasty under Geza, and then his son Stephen, would embrace Christianity and settle permanently. The conversion wasn't solely a consequence of Lechfeld, but the defeat made clear that the old nomadic raiding economy was finished. The Magyars needed to find a new way to relate to their neighbors, and Christianization offered a path toward legitimacy and integration. In a somewhat ironic twist, the Magyars themselves would, just a few centuries later, go on to defend Christian Europe from the Mongols, who used similar mounted tactics. For Otto personally, the victory was transformative in ways that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield itself. His army had hailed him as Imperator on the field, a title with deliberate echoes of Rome that no German king had convincingly claimed. 7 years later, in 962, Pope John XII crowned Otto as Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, formalizing his newly won imperial authority. Lechfeld didn't single-handedly recreate the Holy Roman Empire, long fractured since Charlemagne's days, but it provided the credibility that made Otto's ambitions real. He'd proven he could do what no ruler had managed in living memory: unite the duchies, confront the Magyars, and win decisively. The broader European significance of Lechfeld truly can't be overstated, as it stabilized Central Europe at a critical and fragile juncture. Notably, the 10th century saw Western Christendom beset simultaneously by Magyar raids from the east, Vikings from the north, and attacks from the Islamic world. Lechfeld eliminated one of those three existential threats permanently, and showed that coordinated action under strong leadership could work. It powerfully reinforced the feudal model in which regional lords owed service to a king who could organize large-scale defense in return. Lechfeld entered the collective memory of medieval Europe almost immediately after the fighting had stopped. Bishop Ulrich of Augsburg, whose defense of the city had been so crucial, was canonized in 993 through the official papal process. He became the first person ever formally canonized by a pope, and his story became deeply intertwined with the battle's larger narrative. This reinforced the powerful idea that Lechfeld had been a divinely ordained victory of Christendom over the pagan invaders of the East. Otto himself actively cultivated this interpretation, presenting the victory as evidence of God's favor and his own fitness to rule. In Hungary, the memory of Lechfeld carried a very different and far more complex emotional weight among the Magyar people. The defeat marked the painful end of the nomadic warrior tradition and the beginning of a difficult transition to settled Christian life. Hungarian chronicles would later frame the battle as a tragic, but ultimately necessary turning point in their long national story. They acknowledged the scale of the military disaster while simultaneously emphasizing the cultural transformation that followed in its wake. The execution of Bolcsú, Lel, and Szür became the stuff of enduring Hungarian legend, with vivid stories of their defiance before death. Notably, from a military perspective, Lechfeld is often cited as definitive proof of heavy cavalry's superiority over light cavalry in pitched battle. But that reading oversimplifies what actually happened on the field that hot August day in 955. The Magyar flanking maneuver very nearly succeeded, and only Otto's personal leadership and Conrad's sacrifice prevented total catastrophe. The battle demonstrated the critical importance of discipline, unit cohesion, and command under pressure as much as any weapon's advantage. Those human qualities, more than any particular weapon system or formation, were what ultimately won the day. Lechfeld fully deserves its place among the most decisive battles of European history for what it permanently changed. It reshaped the political geography of Central Europe, accelerated Hungary's Christianization, and laid the Holy Roman Empire's true foundation. It was the moment when a fragmented, terrorized collection of duchies proved it could function as something greater than its individual parts. For the Magyars, it was the closing of one long and bloody chapter and the reluctant, painful opening of another. The floodplain south of Augsburg became the ground on which the political shape of medieval Europe truly began to emerge.